Greetings and welcome to today's hour-long painting lesson. Before we jump into it here today, I'd quickly like to take a minute to talk about materials, starting with what we are painting on, this canvas board here. It is essentially 9 inches by 7.5. You're more than welcome to use a much larger canvas or a much smaller canvas. Just be aware that the larger you go, the more detail you can incorporate, but the longer it will take. Now, I'm using this canvas board, and this is really what it looks like from different dimensions. And I'm using this for a couple of reasons. One, they're quite small, they're easy to stack, they're great for storing. They're a great way to get a painting out fairly quickly if you don't have 40 or 50 hours. So that's really why I'm using this. It's also great because it's fairly thick, as you can see. So I can use mediums like Sharpie, and it won't show through the back of the canvas here. So let's talk about that for a minute. In terms of mediums and materials, what I've drawn on this with here is some colored pencil for the rough outlines of things, just kind of jotting down ideas. I also have a little grid here. And then I also went over the finite lines with a black fine-tipped Sharpie. And I did that because it'll ensure that when I paint the background, and I'm a little bit rough with the background, and I kind of paint over portions of the foreground, I'll still be able to see those drawings through those first initial layers of paint because acrylics are semi-transparent and these are very sharp, defined lines. Now, with that said, you do need to be careful here if you're working with a regular canvas because the black Sharpie will show through. And if you do decide to work on a regular canvas, don't worry about losing your line work and all of your drawings because you can always go back to the start of this video, look at it, look at the drawing, redraw it out, and you'll get better at drawing through that process anyway. So it won't be a bad thing, in fact it might actually be a great thing. I would like to apologize for the background sounds. I am currently in the middle of the city trying to film this nice little nature scene. So there are a couple of little noise distractions. But with that said, let's keep talking about our materials. So here I have a little glass of water, and I'm using this to clean my brushes. And the water is also great because it's going to thin our acrylic paint so we can apply much more sharp lines, but it's also going to extend the wet life of them so they stay wet longer. I also have a little drying cloth underneath here, and this is going to be just for wiping off my brushes, keeping them clean, so I can switch between colors when I'd like. Then, from there, let's quickly talk about brushes. I'm going to be using about 6 brushes in this lesson here today. I'm going to start by talking about the 3 square-headed brushes. I have a large, a medium, and a small. And I like to use the large one for blocking in big areas. It's great because it has a square head, which means it can work sharply around subjects, and it can hold a lot of paint. Then I have the medium-sized square-headed brush, and I like this one because, again, it has a nice sharp edge for blocking in areas. You can hold a good amount of paint, and it gets the job done with a little bit more detail than the last brush. Finally, we have the smaller square-headed brush, and this is really what I do a lot of my detail work with. It's good because it can hold a good amount of paint, as you can see by its head. It has those sharp edges, so it can work around sharp edges, and when you turn it this way, it gets much smaller. It almost looks like a round-headed brush or a liner brush, and that means you can use that edge or the corner of it to really do some great detail work. So I'm a big fan of this brush. From there, I'm using 2 round-headed brushes, and I like to use these for softer applications, things like clouds, mist, things that have more of a feathered edge, and that's because these innately have more of a rounded edge, and they're great for getting a bit of a softer look. Great for clouds and that sort of thing. Then finally, I have an old square-headed brush. So this is very similar to what this used to be. However, I've kind of taken the bristles, I've peeled them back, as you can see, and I'm giving it a very rough look here. And I'm doing that so that we can use this brush specifically for a dabbing motion, and when you make a dabbing motion with it, you render just a great number of imprints on the canvas, and it saves so much time. Imagine using, say, the smaller round-headed brush. 1 application, 2 applications, 3. You now have 3 dots, you've made 3 strokes. Whereas with this, you do that once, and you might get 5, 10, 15 different little applications. And they'll be much smaller because we're getting it from each bristle of the brush, whereas with the other, it's the amalgamation of them. So this can save a lot of time. It's great for implication, great for stars, and you'll see that in this upcoming lesson. But that is essentially what we are using for brushes. We are also going to be using a glass picture frame here. I'm using that as a palette. I'm using this because the paint doesn't sink into it, which is great. And then I'm also using a Mars black paint, a titanium white, primary red, primary yellow, burnt umber, and here I'm actually using a French ultramarine blue. And I'm using this as opposed to a primary blue because it's a little bit warmer. It has a little bit of a purple in it, and it'll make our night sky scene here just feel a little bit more cozy. Though you are more than welcome to use a primary blue, you can render something very similar to the French ultramarine blue by just adding a touch of red into that. But it isn't necessary, and you can render a really beautiful painting with a regular primary blue. But that's what I'm using here for this lesson. So with that being said, that is essentially our materials. Let's jump into the actual painting. We are going to begin here today, as we generally do, with our large square-headed brush. Before I add any paint to it, I'm going to make sure that the tip of it is wet, so I'm just going to dip that in my water here. And then I'm going to wipe it off on my cloth. And that's because I want my brush to be a little bit damp, but not actually wet. And this is going to help extend the wet life of our paint. It'll help us drag the paint outwards, but it won't add too much water to the point where it thins the paint beyond repair. So what we're going to do here is we're going to grab a good amount of titanium white paint, and I'm going to apply that to the horizon of our painting. As you can see, the mountains are still visible through our first application of paint. Then I'm adding a little bit of water, wiping it off, just as we did before, grabbing some additional paint. Here, I'm going to do more of the same, just adding a little bit of that titanium white to the bottom, and then back to my water, cleaning my brush. Should be damp at this point. Then I'm going to grab some of my French ultramarine blue. Again, you are more than welcome to use a primary blue. It just won't be as warm, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Now, I grabbed a lot of paint, so I'm kind of spreading it loosely across my canvas here, above our application of white. Then, I'm going to combine it, spread it out, and then down, just like this. Using a very soft application, as it'll make the application much less streaky. Generally, if you find that you're getting a very streaky aesthetic, it's simply because you're applying too much pressure with the brush. There we go. So, now I'm going to dip my brush back into the water. We just wanted to get a nice, brighter horizon there. Now I'm going to put this brush away for a minute. I'm going to grab my old square-headed brush. We're going to work on the sky, we're going to work on a bit of a galaxy look, we're going to work on a lot of things here. But to begin, I'm going to begin working in this area and then I'm going to build out. So I'm going to grab some of that French ultramarine blue. I'm going to grab a little bit of Mars black and a little bit of titanium white. The Mars black and the titanium white together will mix to make a gray. They'll kind of neutralize each other and they'll desaturate the blue. Now here you can see that I'm blending it down into our previous application via this tapping motion. So the blue is getting a little bit less desaturated there, and we're moving a little bit of it up. Let's grab a little bit more blue. You can spread it out still with the brush, as you can see. And then once you have it applied in a good area, grab a little bit more titanium white, a little bit more Mars black. you can use this tapping motion, just kind of fix it all up. I'm going to go down almost to the bottom, as you can see. It's making it much more gray, but that's good. We don't want our background to be too saturated, otherwise we won't have any attention in the foreground. You can even take this pigment and move it over here. At some point the blue will dry, but that is just fine. Don't you worry about that. We can work on top of it and we can continue to blend with it. So now let's do a little bit more of that over on this side. We'll take our blue, as we did before, scrape it about, take some titanium white, take some Mars black. I want the edges of the painting to be a little bit darker, so we'll use a little bit less titanium white in this area and we'll use a little bit more Mars black. Yet again, we're tapping almost to the bottom. And why we're tapping it is because we're creating the implication of clusters of stars in the background. It isn't a smooth, soft application. It's something that implies just thousands, millions of little specks of implications of something all the way back here. Makes it much more interesting. There we are. Now we're going to go back and we're going to do it to that side. So we're doing this a couple of times, and it's going to reinforce our ability to do it. We'll know exactly what we're trying to do. We'll get much better at it. Repetition really is key when learning a new subject, when trying to learn a trade, when painting. You can even take some of that pigment over here just to ensure that we have a very cohesive, similar look on both sides. Look very symmetrical, which is not a bad thing. There we are. Now, as you can see, the sides are slightly more saturated than the middle. And that means we can do two things. We can either saturate the middle a little bit more, or we can desaturate the edges. We can desaturate the edges by adding more black and white, or we can resaturate the middle by adding more blue. Now, we'll talk a lot about desaturating things in this painting. So in this instance, I want to saturate it. So here, you can see I'm wiping off my brush. I'm getting it nice and clean. I'll go back to my palette. We'll grab a little bit of primary blue, or French ultramarine blue. Just reapply that up here. Don't ever worry about applying anything wrong with acrylics, because in 5 minutes they'll be dry and you can reapply. You can fix things. You can keep trying. Grab a little bit more blue. I'm starting off with very minimal amounts, and I will slowly build up. It's a lot easier with acrylics to add than it is to subtract generally. So we work in steps. Like this. It takes a little bit more time. But in lessons like these, where we have an hour plus, might as well. There we are. It's already starting to look a lot better. Grab some more blue, add that over here. And all of the dots, the implications, they're very subtle at this point. But that's great. We're also not using much titanium white, as you can see, yet. And we're doing that purposefully because we want this area to be much more highlighted, and that means we need the rest to be a little bit darker for it to stand out properly. Now, this is a little bit dark, so I'll show you how we can correct that. We'll take a little bit of our blue, moving it off to the side just to make sure that I don't get too much. Going to apply that right there, grab a little bit of titanium white, move it off to the side just to ensure we don't have too much. Then we can just add that on. You can see it's a much nicer transition now from this to here. subtle, but it works. Again, we can move it over to the other side as well, just so it's nice and cohesive. So that's really the start. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move up above this area, and then we'll come back to it. So I want this area to get slightly darker as we move up towards the edges of the painting. And we're doing this for a couple of reasons. The first being it's natural. As the sun goes down, we lose light as we move up. But also we're creating a vignette in the painting, which is important because it draws the eye towards the middle of the painting, as the eye will naturally go to the brightest area. So if you make the edges of your painting darker, you ensure that the viewer's eye doesn't escape through any other way subconsciously. So it's a little trick, and it works quite well in leading the viewer's eye. Now again, let's go back up to the top. I want the corners to be quite dark, so here I'm actually going to start with a Mars Black. And remember, we don't just have to tap with this brush, we can also use a stroke just to get the pigment on there. Then we'll grab some of our ultramarine or primary blue. Then I'll begin this tapping motion, and you can see just how dark it is in comparison to everything else. So we'll take a little bit of our titanium white, and we'll work that in as well. Now as you can see here, it's very dark still, it's very desaturated still. And the more white we add, the more desaturated it'll get, the more it'll turn into a gray rather than a blue. So this is something that I wanted to show you. And that's when you add too much black, it's hard to recover from in that layer. We can let that dry and then we can come back to it. But this is why we start with minimal amounts of application first. So on this side, we're going to do things more so the right way. So I'm going to clean my brush off a little bit here, just because it has a good amount of paint on it. This is a brush that you don't want to be damp frequently though, because when it's wet, the bristles kind of stick together. And that isn't conducive to what we're trying to do, because then we don't get as many implications. So, highly implore you to wipe the brush off really well before using it. If it's dry, that's so much better, but it doesn't have to be. It just needs to be fairly dry. So we did a much better job. We can peel out the bristles again if we want, apply a little bit of pressure, and we'll go back up here. This time we'll grab some black like we did, but we'll grab a much more minimal amount. We'll test it on our palette to make sure we don't have too much. So now we'll spread that out. You can see it is much less, and it's much more thin this time. Now we'll grab some of that primary blue or French ultramarine blue, spreading it naturally, and now we'll grab a little bit of titanium white. Now we're applying that dabbing motion, and as you can see, it's much brighter than what we want it to be. So that side's much darker, but to add in white and blue is a lot harder to fix that. Whereas here, it's a lot easier to make it darker. So, we'll get some additional primary blue. We'll work that in. We'll get a little bit of additional Mars Black, and we'll work that in. So it's much easier, as you can see, to work with minimal amounts of paint initially, and to use the pigments that aren't necessarily Mars Black, because Mars Black is a very strong pigment, it's difficult to work with, and it's very overtaking. So you quickly overpower the rest of all of your pigments. Also worth noting, primary colors, including French ultramarine blue and burnt umber, are innately fairly thin and transparent, but whereas titanium white and Mars Black are much more thick, and they will quickly overtake the pigment. So if you feel like you need to make the pigment half brighter, and so you go to add in half of your titanium white, the titanium white's going to overpower it. The same goes for the black. So you need to use less, generally, of the titanium white and the Mars Black if you want a balanced application. Here we go. So here we're just kind of doing more of the same, though I think we're learning a lot by doing more of the same here. Also worth noting, Here it's very reflective, right? And it's a little bit difficult to see perfectly, and that's natural. That's how acrylics are meant to be. So don't get discouraged if it doesn't immediately look the way you want, because sometimes it just needs to dry to get there. So now let's move over to the middle area. I'm going to apply some primary blue. I'm just trying to show you different ways of doing this. French ultramarine blue. I keep saying both because I think a lot of us, there's going to be a good split between who uses what, because we're very used to primary blue. It makes sense with the other primary colors. But I do like the French ultramarine blue a lot right now. Looks great with making night scenes look a little bit warmer. So we added the blue, we're adding a little bit of Mars black to it right now. Grab a little bit of our titanium white. There you can see it matches really well, so we know we're on the right path. Just moving it upwards slowly, but not in a stroke, in a tapping motion. There we go. Now we do need to go back up to that corner because it is a little bit dark, and now that it's dry, we can actually have an effect on it. So I'm going to grab some of our blue, going to grab a little bit of our white, and now we can apply that. The highlights are really going to stand out against the very dark black, so we'll be minimal with them, but we'll create a couple of little interesting patterns and effects there, just so it's always evolving and captivating different ways. We'll go back, we'll grab some primary blue, apply that to the top. Not tapping yet, but we certainly will be. Going to go over a lot of my star there. We can redraw that in later if we don't see it. Adding a little bit of black, a little bit of white, a little bit of white, a little bit of black. Again, the key term there was little bit. We'll try it, we'll apply it, and then we'll fix it if it needs it. But we'll definitely have the ability and room to fix it, should we want to now, because we applied minimally. And we can always add in additional layers. I am going over some areas because acrylics are fairly thin, and a couple of the areas will need it. It's a very cathartic process though. This tapping effect, it's easy, and you want it to look fairly random and ever-changing because it'll make a lot more sense with the context of the painting itself. So we're not always worried about doing things right, we're not worried, but we're just thinking rather about how to do things a little bit differently, make it creative. And that's what we're doing. So now I'm going to wash my brush off a little bit. I'm actually going to let all of this dry, then we're going to come back in and we're going to add just a little bit of a second layer to some areas that are a little bit thin where you can kind of see the canvas showing through. So I'm going to let this dry for about 5 minutes, and I will see you very soon. Now that the painting's dry for the most part, we're going to move back into it. And as you can see, there's still a little bit of glare on the canvas in a couple of areas, more so where there's black, and that's because the black will create a good amount of glare. And you can kind of move the canvas around to see it without it, but just be aware that under certain lighting conditions, your painting won't actually look like it looks. So it can be a little bit deceiving, but just be cognizant of that and don't worry about it too much. I'm not here. With that said, I'm going to grab a little bit of this blue, and for the first time here, we're going to do a little bit of blending on the palette. We've been doing a lot of it over on the painting, but I think it's important that we do it in both cases. Generally, when I'm working on my own paintings, I do most of the blending on the palette, but they both definitely have their attributes and why they work well in different situations, so I thought we'd go over both in this painting lesson. Now I'm going back in and I'm adding some additional applications of what we had before, just thickening them a little bit and moving this pigment all the way around the canvas. It's kind of like a wash at this point, just filling in the little bumps and cracks that were left behind and adding a little bit of color to what we initially had. You can see that I did a lot of it with a scraping motion, dragging it around, but now I am going back and I'm reapplying all of it in the same way we did our initial applications, which is with the tapping motion. Also going to grab a little bit of titanium white, brighten it a little bit, and now we'll throw that in as well. There we are. Looking nice and pretty. We can also work a little bit of it down here if we want as well. Now, I'm fairly satisfied with what we have going on here, and I'm going to begin working in this middle area. This is really where all of the stars are going to be glowing and really coming out from. But I want the color to be slightly different than the rest of the sky, just so it's a little bit more interesting and captivating. So here I'm going to throw a little bit of red into it as well, just to make it stand out and give it a nice little purple. So we'll take some red, just a little bit. We'll move it down there. We'll grab some of our blue, blend them together. And here you can see that it really didn't do too much. It's because the French ultramarine blue is already quite strong. So there we are. It's a little bit of a different tone. I like it. It's a little bit darker. I'm going to begin applying this in the middle. And on the painting you can see that it is much more purple. Now, it's also worth noting that we didn't add any real titanium white or Mars black into this, so it's very thin at this point. And as we go around the edges, you can see the edges from the other dried paint. So that's something we'll need to go back in and work on, but we're just kind of testing the color right now, seeing if it's something we like. Now, it's very wet, and the light's reflecting on it heavily, so it's hard to read the color. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move the camera so you can kind of see what it's like when you move your head in these scenarios. So there we are. We didn't let any of the paint dry, we simply moved the canvas. And that made a big difference on the painting and how we perceive the color in it. So, we're going to go back, we're going to grab more of that pigment, and we'll just continue applying it. Here you can see that I'm just scraping it on, initially, building our first layer. And if we run out of paint, we don't worry, we just grab a little bit more red, blend that into the blue, create something nice and similar. I can see that they're similar because I still have a little bit left on my palette. This one's a little bit more red dominant though. I'm actually not displeased with that. I'm going to move it about on the other side so it looks cohesive. I'm going to move it down to the rest of the painting, and we can kind of scrape it about in the same way we've been doing. Now here you see that it's nice and bright, and here it's quite dark. And that's happening because here we're applying it over a white and it's transparent, so you see the white and the brightness through it. Whereas down here, we get the darker blue through it. And that's an important thing to remember about acrylic paints when blending on the palette. What you have on the palette isn't necessarily what you're going to see on the canvas, because it's going to be an amalgamation of that color and whatever is under it, especially if it's a thin pigment. So that's essentially what we're starting with. Now we're going to have some fun with it. We're going to take some of our titanium white, move that in here, create a bit of a highlighted pigment. This is also going to be a thicker pigment because now it has that titanium white in it. So I'm applying it in the same way, more of this tapping motion. We're brightening it up a little bit. We'll especially need to do that around the edges because they look like they're highlighted with a dark pigment, right? So we'll grab that. So take a couple of applications, but it'll pay off. Applying it around the edges, allowing it to kind of go off in different areas, keep it interesting. Bringing it down to the bottom. It's already looking really captivating. You can see that I'm grabbing a mixture between the blue heavy version and the red heavy version. I'm leaving little openings of the initial colors. I'm not highlighting everything. That'll make it look a lot more natural. And it'll give it a lot more depth because we'll have different areas that stand out. Whereas if it were all the highlighted pigment, it would look flat. Here I'm going to create a little bit more of a mixture on the blue side because I'm working more on the purpley blue side rather than the pink side. We can interject a little bit over here though, if we want. Building it up from this brighter bottom area. We'll do the same on this side. There we are. It's starting to look quite nice. Now this area is still very thin, so we'll need to do another layer with it. We'll grab some primary blue or French ultramarine blue, some of our red, we'll mix it in with the white. We can reapply those darker pigments and work them into other areas as well. Realistically, the more you do this, the more interesting the painting will look, the more depth it will have. There we are. Grab some more titanium white. Now we'll have it some little highlights here and there. As we continue to apply it, the white will mix with the other pigments on the palette, and our applications won't be white anymore. There'll be an amalgamation of the white and the other pigments that we've used previously. There we are. It's looking fairly nice. Really different. Grabbing some more titanium white, some more of our red. Here we have a bit of a pink pigment, a little purple. It's nice and thick because of the titanium white. You can just work that back in. We can even add a little bit of this pigment out in the offshoots of the painting as well, just so that they all kind of shares the same color. If you want it to be a little bit more subtle, I tap it on, use my finger, and I very lightly go over it just to soften it. Here we can add a little bit of that purple down underneath. Not too much though. There we are. Now I want this area to be a bit more highlighted, so I'm going to grab some blue, I'm going to grab some white, mix them together. We won't do this in too many areas. Just be a little bit more an interesting thing. Getting the combination of the blue, the purple, and the pink is really what's going to bring this together. And this side it's very blue heavy, this side's more purple, pinkish heavy. We're just kind of separating them. Now I'm going to leave this purplish pink in the middle here, more purple, but I'm going to grab a little bit more of that highlighted pigment, the blue. I'm going to work that on the other side of it. So it's working around in two different ways. Now you can have a lot of fun with this. You don't have to do this exactly like I'm doing it. But, as you can see, there isn't really a wrong way of doing it. We're just trying to balance all of these highlights. Just like so. Now, I'm going to add a good amount of water to my brush as this portion of our painting is done. We're going to add some stars to it. We're going to do so with our smaller round-headed brush, as you can see here. Going to add a lot of water to it. Going to go back to our palette, grab some titanium white, add a lot of pigment to it, a lot of water. Then I'm going to get close to my painting, going to peel back the bristles, going to launch some paint at the canvas, creating stars. You can do that again. Here we are. Going to the painting. And I'm trying to make it a little bit directional. When you get close to the painting and you peel back, it'll generally work very closely. If you go farther away, you get more of a splatter everywhere. So by going closely, we can follow the arch here. Again, mixing up a lot of that very wet pigment, getting close to the canvas, creating those nice little applications. It'll be sporadic, which is nice because it ensures that all of your applications are different and it's always evolving. And by doing this, you save a lot of time because we're rendering hundreds of little applications with just a flick of the brush. Whereas otherwise, we'd have to draw these all in. It would take a very long time, and we wouldn't get anything close to as small as what we are right now because we wouldn't have a brush that could make implications that small. So we'll grab a little bit more. Go back and do this a couple of times. There we are. We don't want it to look too chaotic or too messy. We just need enough. We need it to be interesting. So that is essentially what our sky is going to look like, void of the two larger stars that I'm going to want to incorporate fairly shortly. So with that said, let's now move down here while we have the colors out and work on our water. Our water is very much going to be a reflection of this area right here. So let's begin with our old square-headed brush yet again. I'm going to take some titanium white, apply that to the back area, just like so. Now, the brush, the water, it's all going to be a little bit dirty. We're not going to get a pure white. This is going to be a little bit more blue and purple. It's not a bad thing though. It'll look quite nice. Then we'll grab some blue, some red, some Mars black, just a little bit, some titanium white, and begin to apply that as well. I'm moving it back into the white through this tapping motion, creating a little bit of a gradient, makes it look nice and bright. Then we'll grab a little bit more blue. This is a reflection, the sky's a little bit more blue in that area. Grab a little bit more Mars black. There we go. We'll apply this. This time it's very dark, it's a little bit more desaturated. It's not a bad thing. And again, I'm just kind of blending it via tapping motions upwards. Just like so. Now we're going to grab a little bit more blue, a little bit more of that Mars black, not too much though. Apply it to the bottom, do the same tapping motion, move it on up. Now we'll go back to our palette, grab a little bit more. We can scrape it on, remember, if we want to save a little bit of time, and then use the tapping motion. Going to grab a little bit more of our black for the farther areas. And I'm not doing a pure reflection. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be a copy of what's happening on the top to the bottom. It's just going to be a reflection of the same colors and ideas. And I'm doing that because I don't want to overcomplicate the bottom. I don't want to make a full circle. So we're just doing this lightly. There we are. It's quite nice. Now I'm going to wash my brush. We'll probably come back and do a second application of that, but I want to let that dry first, see how it looks, and then we can make our decisions from there. Generally, it's best with acrylics not to make hasty decisions because we have so much time if we want it. We do a layer, we let it dry for 5 minutes, we reassess, and then we work from there. We don't continuously need to work from it wet into wet into wet into wet as it's wet, because, again, it's highly malleable. Now, while I wait for that to dry, I'm going to take my smaller, square-headed brush. I'm going to begin working in some mountains in the backdrop. So, I'm going to ensure that my brush is nice and damp, just like we did before in the sky. I'm going to go to my palette, we'll grab some of our titanium white, grab a little bit of our Mars black, mix up a bit of a gray. Just like that. Make it a darker gray if we want. This is going to be in the distance. It's going to be for our mountains. And I can still see the drawings of a lot of my mountains here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the side that's facing us, not the side that's facing the back and all of the stars. I'm going to start drawing that in with this darker gray pigment. I'm using the side of the square-headed brush because it's very sharp and it's very watered down, which is allowing me to get those very nice fine applications. It's not looking toothy at all, which is important. So here this is. Just moving that down to where we'll have all of our little houses. I'm going to go back, grab some more of that pigment. Continue to apply it in the same way. Starting on the edges, and then I'm moving it inwards as well, because we want to ensure our first application with it is the most sharp and define it as the most pigment, we have the most control. And as we lose control and we lose pigment, then we do the less important areas, the areas that don't need to be as well crafted, like the inner portions. Because we can go back in and redo them and they don't require an incredibly sharp edge like the rest of the painting. Or the rest of the mountain, like the edge. So here we're just moving this all down yet again. Going back, ensuring that there aren't any toothy areas showing through. Wetting our brush yet again. Now, we'll make some more. Just like that. Going to go back up into the painting, top of the mountain here. Kind of lost it, so making a little bit of an educated guess. But the pigment I'm using is a little bit bright anyway, so we'll grab a little bit of black, we'll mix that back in there. And we'll just begin again. There we are. As you can see, it's getting very granular. The tooth of the canvas is showing through. And that's simply because I'm losing pigment and water. We wanted to make it nice and sharp, we dipped our brush in more water, and we got some additional paint as well. Now, we're ready to go back into this. As we get towards the bottom of the mountains, they should be a little bit darker as less light can get to them. just as you see there. Now this part of the mountain's interesting because it's a divot, which means that it'll get some light, but not too much. So let's start working on that. We're going to take some titanium white, we're going to mix it over into the area that we were just working in, make a bit of a lighter gray, not too light. That should be just right here. That's why we're mixing on our palette, so we can make the mistakes there. And now we'll go in and we'll work on the brighter sides of the mountains, the ones that are receiving more light from the backdrop. Working fairly finely, but I'm putting out little jittery areas that connect to the mountain, and I'm doing that to show that the mountain isn't perfect. It's not a triangle. It has divots and paths and trails. It makes it much more captivating. We're using a lighter and a darker area for our mountains here to incorporate depth, as light will wrap around a subject. But we'll go back in and we'll add significantly more detail and highlights to it as well. This really is just the first application, blocking in the colors that we want. The values, rather. There we are. Starting to turn into a painting, isn't it? Now, grab a little bit more of that pigment, get a little bit more water, thin it, just so we can drag it out a little bit better. Now we'll probably put a lot of trees over this area here, but we can start with this. Use this analogy a lot when painting, but it's a lot like building a house. You start with a foundation, concrete, it's not that aesthetic, it's not that attractive, and then you build on top of it and you make a beautiful house. That's very much what we're doing right here with the mountains. Now we're going to continue the mountains out this way, and a lot of them is going to be covered by trees, but it's good to get that nice backing in there. So we'll grab some of our white, a little bit of our black. We'll just continue making these the way we were before. Just like so. You can see that I'm sometimes using a circular motion with the brush to blend things out a little bit more easily. Then I need to make all of this area darker. We're going to put a little town there, some little city lights, but in the meantime, we need a dark base to work on top of. So I'm going to take some pure Mars black, apply that here, go all the way to the other sides of our mountains, get some water to thin it out, and then we can blend it with the water up into our mountains. And here you can see that I'm using it to create little divots up the mountains, little details, little pathways. It makes it feel a lot more real, gives it a little bit more depth as well. Here we go. Just like that. And do this on the other side as well. You see how it's not just a pure black that we're moving around now. Because we're watering it down, it's very transparent, and we can see different shades of gray with it instead. And there, we're finally starting to render some nice detail in there. Let's grab some titanium white, good amount of titanium white. Grab a little bit of our French ultramarine blue, mix those together, create a nice highlight. And let's use this in the mountains because the blue from the sky is going to reflect down onto the mountains. I'm going to predominantly use this on the side that has the light hitting it. It's facing the back. Holding my breath for a lot of this detail work helps me steady my hand. I implore you to do the same. Though if you have to be instructional, you can't do it all the time. Blending it in certain areas and letting it be a little bit sharper in others. Though it's the background in mountains, so I don't want it to have too much detail because I don't want to distract from everything else. So sometimes you need to make things look a little bit less natural, a little bit less real, to make everything else pop out a little bit more. Here we'll grab a little bit of additional titanium white, mix up a bit of a stronger variant. We can add that on too. Starting from the top, working my way down. I'm going to do a little bit of a tapping effect just to create a little bit of interesting texture in there. As you can see. We can even throw a little bit of it on the other side. Maybe it's snow. But just on the tops. If you find you don't like it, you can add some water, move it off with your finger. Then, take a little bit of a darker pigment, a little bit of a darker gray, let me show you, like that. And just rework that over top. So don't be afraid to try things when painting. You can always go back and fix them. It's looking quite good now. Fairly happy with it. And now I think it's time that we can go back and rework on this bottom area. So, I'm going to take that old square-headed brush, going to take some of our titanium white, a little bit of our primary blue, a little bit of our Mars black to desaturate it, our red. It's a little bit too gray, too desaturated, so I'll add some blue back in, add a little bit of white. Then, we'll reapply. And I'm doing this because the first layer, while nice, is a little bit too thin. So I'm just adding this over top, and it'll be semi-transparent so you can still kind of see the difference through it. Then we'll get a little bit more of our titanium white, a little bit more of our primary blue, our red. We'll add this to the back. Just rebuild a little bit of that depth. Keeping it very subtle. By going over areas more with the tapping, you'll flatten them out a little bit, which is sometimes a really nice thing. Now I want to make the bottom a little bit darker, so we'll grab a little bit of that Mars black, we'll grab a little bit of primary red, our French ultramarine blue or primary blue. Add that to the bottom and tap upwards. There we go. yet again, I am a big fan. So now we're washing the brush off quite well. We don't want it to dry with all the paint on it. That will ruin the brush. So now what I want to do is continue to work in this area here. So I'm going to test to see if it's dry with my finger. And it is. So now I can go back in and add some trees. I want them to be fairly green, but a little bit darker. So we'll probably use a primary yellow and a Mars black. It'll be our first time using this primary yellow in this painting. And we have a couple of brush choices to do this with. You're going to want to do something small because you're going to want to render trees. So perhaps the smaller square-headed brush or the older square-headed brush because it can make all of the different applications. Here, I'm actually going to opt for the smaller square-headed brush, and we're going to see how that works out. The larger the canvas, the easier this process will be. So I'm going to grab some of our primary yellow, move it down here. I'm going to grab a little bit of our Mars black, and by a little bit I mean a little bit, because it will quickly turn it into an olive dark green. Now it's a bit of a warmer green, so take a little bit of our French ultramarine blue, we'll cool it down a little bit. There, you can see. Try to add in some trees here. Just the implication of them. So we're adding in a little bit of green. Just like that. Working it up the mountain a little bit. And you won't really see any detail from that far away. Just having the implication there is more than enough. I'm adding a little bit of titanium white to thicken it. Probably be able to see it a little bit better here. Now I'm using the edge of the brush to get a little bit of additional detail. It won't make it look like an actual tree, but it will make it look like the implication of a tree, which is really all we want here. We'll have some real trees in the foreground, but it's very subtle. It's almost unnoticeable. Let me turn up the brightness in the camera and you'll really see what I'm talking about. So here we turned up the camera brightness, and as you can see there is just a hint of green there in the backdrop. So we're not looking for anything very stark, we're just looking for something subtle. So we're just going to continue with this for a little bit. We're going to build it up, grabbing a little bit more titanium white, some of that primary yellow, a little bit of Mars black. And remember, we're not going to get this color, we're going to get an amalgamation of this color and what we have on the canvas, because it will show through to a point. Here I'm just tapping on simple implications of trees. There we go. Just like that. Blend a couple of them together, just so it doesn't look too detailed. Not in the backdrop here. It's not what we want. Nice little tree lines. Can even work a little bit of it up the mountain if we want. There we go. So now we have a nice subtle tree line there in the back of the painting. Now we can add in some little houses to it. These are going to be just as subtle and small. We'll grab some burnt umber, move that down here, grab a little bit of titanium white, thicken it, brighten it, a little bit of Mars black, desaturate it, darken it. Now we can draw in a couple little cabins. Some are sticking out of the trees, some are fully in front on the water. We want them to look a little bit different, but they're far enough away that we don't have to worry too much about detail. They're also very implied, so we won't have to do too much with them. Now this is a little cabin, so we'll throw some roofs on them. We'll get some Mars black, mix that in with what we have here. Just with a single application, I should get the side of each roof. Give it a little bit more dimension. Some will have flat roofs, some will be a little bit more intricate. It's all very subtle though. Then, this is going to be a snow-covered piece. It's not going to be snowing in the painting, but there's going to be snow on the ground. So, what I'm going to do is take some of that titanium white, move it over here, grab a little bit of our French ultramarine blue, maybe a little bit of our Mars black, grab a little bit more of that titanium white, move it over here. And we're not looking for a pure titanium white for the snow here, because it's very far away and it'll have a lot of reflective light from everything else. So, we'll just throw this on the roofs of the houses to begin with. There we are. It's very messy here, it's very impressionistic, but it's meant to be. Again, most importantly, it's all very subtle. Then we'll grab a little bit more titanium white, mix that in, and we'll create a little bit of a ground here. You can have it going back into the trees, in between different houses, just like that. And, of course, we need to throw a little bit on the trees. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a tapping effect on the top areas of the green. Nice and small, nice and subtle. If we need to, we'll add some water. Can add some couple prominent trees. Doing so just with a little bit of line work. I'm only doing this in the fronts. If things are a little bit too stark, you can add a little bit of water. We can put our finger over them, thin them out a little bit. Or we can go back to our green and reincorporate that in with them. There we are. Now, I'm going to incorporate some light into these houses. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of a break. We're going to clean our brush extremely well. We're going to clean our water because we're going to be working with a lot of yellow and orange. If we were to apply a yellow on top of the blue or the purple, because it would mix with the color underneath, it would actually look like a green. And we wouldn't get the bright color, the yellow, the warmth that we actually wanted. It would also mix with the blue in here and make more of a green. So we're going to clean everything and then we're going to come right back. Now that we have some clean water in our dish, we're going to be taking our smaller square-headed brush, some of our primary yellow paint, move that over to a nice clean area. We'll grab some titanium white. Make sure that it's none of the diluted titanium white that we've used from grabbing other pigments. This is going to thicken the yellow. It's going to make it slightly more, or rather less transparent. It's going to make it a little bit brighter. I'm going to add a couple little windows into these. If For the most part, you can see that I'm doing them horizontally, but I'm also switching vertically. Houses are a little bit more distant over here, a little bit less defined. So I'm being smaller with my applications, for the most part. Now we have some light coming from them. So we'll do a little tap into the water here, do a little bit of a reflection. Finding where it is, and just moving it down. Doing a little tap with my brush. Sometimes there are openings in the application, but that's not a bad thing. Makes it much more interesting. Then if you want, you can make your brush extremely wet, very watery. You can come down to the bottom of the application, throw in some water, and really drag it out. It'll be very subtle, create a nice little gradient. There we are. Like that a lot. Now that that's done, we're going to begin working over here to our middle ground section. We're going to have some trees, we're going to have the little cabin here, we'll have some snow in the foreground, and we're going to begin all of this with the trees themselves. And I'm going to begin by mixing up a green like we did before. So, let's grab some of that primary yellow. This time we'll grab a little bit of a primary blue to make the green instead of a Mars black. It'll be a little bit more vibrant, as you can see. Get a little bit of Mars black in there. And we get a little bit of titanium white, again, just because we don't want it to be too dark or too desaturated. We can grab a little bit of yellow if we want to liven it up again. Now, using the smaller square-headed brush, just kind of moving it up to where I feel we'll want it. Now, I lost my drawings in here, so at this point I'm going to kind of guess. We can go back to the video, or we can do it intuitively. I'm going to do the intuitive route here. Not too worried about it. Just kind of mapping in where I want everything. Then, I'm going to take the old square-headed brush. I'm going to take a lot of that pigment with a little bit of additional Mars black. Going to begin applying some of the other types of trees. I'm doing this predominantly along the edge just to give us a bit of a border to work with. We'll of course be adding snow to the tops of it, so it won't look unnatural with the snow here on the ground. Now we'll make a little bit more yellow, primary blue, a little bit of Mars black, a little bit of titanium white, a little bit more Mars black, a little bit more titanium white, a little bit more of that yellow. Just to ensure that we have a good, decent first application. There we are. We can even spread this out down towards the bottoms if we want. Just like that. Now we know all of the area in which we want to be green. So I'll wash my brush quite well. Then we can start working in some detail. Going to be taking the smaller square-headed brush here, grabbing some of that pigment, making it a little bit darker. Want it to stand out a little bit better, a little more saturated. We'll begin to add some foliage to our trees. Now at the tops of the trees, it should kind of flick up because it's very light and it doesn't have much weight holding it down. But when you get towards the middle of the tree, the branches go outwards in both directions as they get more equal weight, and then they start to move down as they get too heavy here at the bottom. So you want to transition where the branches go up, and then that way, that way, that way, that way. Grab a little bit more. You notice I started very subtly at first with these, and now I'm slowly building them out. Your trees can blend together. That's just fine. Or separate them a little bit later with snow and all of that. Right now we're just blocking in all of our greens, building our foundation to which we will then add detail on top of. There we are. Now the trees that are a little bit farther away, we can change their color a little bit if we want, or the ones in the foreground. I think we're going to make the ones in the foreground a little bit darker as they are farther away from the background and the light. So I'm just getting a little bit of a Mars black here, and we'll blend that into the closer ones. The pigment on my canvas is still wet, so I can just do this fairly easily. Some water. Grab a little bit more. The top will be a little bit brighter because it won't have any shadows cast on it from these other trees, where the bottoms will be a lot darker because we'll have a lot more shadow. It's the same rule as what happened in the background with the mountains. Now we'll build up a little bit more of a darker pigment yet again. We'll just keep doing this until we feel like we have a good amount of depth in our trees. Just doing a lot of little tapping. You can add it to the sides of even the trees here that are opposite to the backdrop. We have our lines in there, and then I just kind of move them out with some water. See? Very quick, easy process. We don't need too much detail in this area, despite the fact that it's close to the foreground, because we'll be covering so much of it with snow. Just slowly building up that contrast. Trees that are closest to us are a bit darker, and again, the side of them that is not facing the light is also a bit darker, which is why we can add some depth to the trees in the back here too. Now, before we add snow to any of that, we need to let it dry. Otherwise, if we added the white and the blue right now, it would probably just turn into more of a green. So, what we're going to do in the meantime is work on our little cabin here. We're going to grab a little bit more of that burnt umber that we used before. I'm going to grab some titanium white. I'm actually not going to use any of the Mars black for the first application here. Just want to see what this looks like. Using the smaller square-headed brush because it has a very sharp defined edge. There we go. Looking really nice. Then we will grab a little bit of the Mars black, a little bit more of our burnt umber. And we'll apply this to the other side, rather the side of the house, because it won't be receiving any light and it will be a little bit darker. Be good for a depth. Then we can take that same pigment, just work in some logs. Little strokes, just like that. Nothing that really stands out, just a little bit of detail. If you want it to stand out, you can just grab a bit of a darker mixture and reapply. See? Still fairly subtle. We need to work it on the other side too. Then we'll grab a little bit of pure black, mix it over here with a little bit of the brown, create the roof. We'll add a lot of snow to the roof though, so this really is just a base layer. There we are. Now for the door, I'm going to go with a very similar color, but make it a little bit warmer, so throw in a little bit of red. We'll also throw in a couple of windows in here. But first I want to create a little division between the door and the house. So we'll just make this side a little bit darker, show a little bit of a shadow. Like that, nice and easy. And then if you want, you can take that same pigment and continue to separate the wooden beams. There we are. We can also go back in and add a brighter brown to further define that if we want, but at this point I think we'll sit with that. It's just the first layer, it's the base layer, and I think it's a good step in the right direction. Then we're going to switch over to the medium-sized square-headed brush. We're going to make sure that it's just damp. Grab some pure Mars black, and yet again we're creating a base layer. Just for the snow here. If we want to give it a little bit of dimension, a little bit of hue, we can add some blue to it. Don't need to do much. We're going to be painting over the entirety of this. We're just giving it a nice little base to put our snow on top of. You want it to be fairly thick, so you don't want to water it down with water too much. There we go. Just like that. So the trees aren't finished, the cabin isn't finished, the snow isn't finished, but we need to let those dry. And then we can come back in, add some snow, and really make this painting look quite beautiful. Then we'll move into the foreground. Also, a great thing to do while we paint is simply to clean our water yet again. Now we are going to jump right back into the painting with our smaller square-headed brush. I'm going to grab some of our titanium white paint. I'm going to grab some of our French ultramarine blue, mix those up, and we'll have a nice little pigment there. I'm going to use this as snow, and I'm using it as opposed to a pure white because I don't want it to be too stark. I don't want it to stand out, I don't want it to look overexposed or washed out. Just looking for the right amount. Now for the tree up here, I'm just kind of dabbing on the top applications, areas in which I feel the snow could fall. That doesn't just mean applying it to the sides, it also means applying it to the inside as well. That's important. You can use the corner of your brush for lots of little applications, or you can use the side of your brush for much larger pieces here. You can also use a combination as I'm doing. Now I'm going to dip my brush back in the water a little bit, and I like that pigment, so I'm going to mix some more of it. So some titanium white, some French ultramarine blue, much more titanium white than the blue. And we'll go back in. Doing this to all of our trees in the mid-ground here. There we are, starting to look quite nice. Some of the trees will look like they're blending together a little bit, and that isn't a bad thing. They all do exist in the same forest, they are all getting the same snowfalls, and some of them are touching even. I'm creating a lot of applications here at the bottom, and then I kind of blend up subtly, creating a little bit of a gradient. And that's because the snow won't fall underneath these areas because other branches are covering them. So here we're starting at the bottom, we're moving it out, and we subtly blend it upwards a little bit, leaving some darker areas. Nice and subtle. Now yet again we need to mix more pigment. And I'm not mixing a lot of pigment initially, because going back and remixing it makes us a stronger painter. We get more accustomed to it. See, this time it's too blue, so we'll take more white. We'll just fix it. But through that process, going back and remixing pigments, you become much better at what you do. You can also reapply certain applications. As they dry, they may be a little bit more transparent, or you see the darker previous applications through them, and you just want to apply a little bit more. There we are. Grab a little bit more. This time we'll apply it to the roof, just like so. And then we can even apply it down onto the land. Starting predominantly close to the house, and then I'm blending outwards. It's amazing what a difference the snow can make, isn't it? Applying a little bit more on the house, making sure that's a nice thick application there. Then yet again, blending outwards. Here you notice that it's darker around the edges. That's because the paint's dissipating. It's becoming more transparent. We're seeing a lot more of the black show through. Which isn't a bad thing, it just looks like depth, right? We can't have it all be the same level of white in this. It needs variation. Here I'm bringing a little bit of that up, and I'm opening areas, I'm separating areas, doing a bit of a tapping effect. And that just makes it look so much more real. We can even take a little bit of this, add it to the top of the door there. Maybe even a little bit on some of the logs. There'll be little protruding pieces on the ends. We'll add that to them. If you find that it sticks out a little bit too much, again, we can just add a lot of water to our brush. Wash it off. Just like that. Now it kind of looks like there's a snow blowing over a little bit of the house, which is a really nice effect. Going to go back to my palette though, mix some more of that blue, because we have more trees to do. There we are. Being a little bit more loose with the ones in the background. I don't want all of my trees or fallen snow to look the same. Doing a lot of these. A little bit of a tapping effect on an angle of each side of the tree. but not forgetting to go back into the middle once in a while. Not adding too much snow right here because I want the roof to stand out. Just enough. There we go. Some of the trees are going to the bottom, some aren't, snow-wise. Again, if we had too much snow, just add a lot of water, take it off with our brush. We can also go back in and add darker areas there, should we want to, but I want to finish these trees first before we do that, so we know exactly how much we want to work with there. Now, my palette, or my water here, despite the fact that we've been using blue, isn't very blue. So I still feel fairly confident grabbing some of this primary yellow, titanium white, mixing up something nice and thick. I'm throwing in a little window here. Just like that. It's a little bit big. You could definitely make it smaller. We can go back in and just add a little bit of burnt umber there. But I'll also throw in a little bit of a highlight into the snow. A little bit of yellow light. Just being emitted right there. Now, because we had so much water on our brush, it kind of peeled back a little of the paint. So that's something you do have to be careful of when you use a lot of water. It can peel back non-completely dry layers, but we can go back up in and fix that up very easily. It's a good lesson to learn, so I'm glad it happened. Also, that's a great note to in regard to anything in painting. When bad things happen or mistakes happen, not really a bad thing. It's a great thing because it's a lesson that you can learn, that you can take with you through all of your following paintings, and it will save you so much time and effort. So one little mistake isn't really a mistake. It's a learning lesson that makes the future much better. Just a good way of looking at it. Now from there, I'm going to go in and work on these trees while I let all of that dry. I'm going to do so initially by working on the trunks and the bases. So grab some burnt umber, grab some of my Mars black, grab a little bit of titanium white, mix up a nice mixture here. I can still see the bottoms, which is nice. And again, I lost the tops, but we'll just draw this in how we want to. See how it goes. We could go back to the start of the video or look at the sketch, but I'm feeling fairly confident with this right now. This one will be the tallest. Get a little bit more of that Mars black, a little bit more of that burnt umber. Do a couple of applications. We used a good amount of water to ensure that our line was very sharp. There we go. Now we need to let that dry before we add on the green, otherwise the green will mix with the brown and we won't get the pigment that we actually want. So I'm going to let that dry. I'm going to clean my water, my brush yet again, and I will see you back here in just a minute. Now we're going to jump back into the painting as we have before with our smaller square-headed brush. Going to grab some of our yellow, mix it down to our green, and our green's still a little bit wet, but we'll remix it anyway just so that we're in good practice of it. Get a little bit of that black, a little bit of our titanium white to thicken it, and a little bit of our blue. Now the blue is overpowering, so we'll take more yellow, and we'll just keep mixing it. Worst case scenario, we have a good amount of pigment to work from. There we are. It's a nice rich green yet again. So now we'll take this, start at the top of our tree, apply some little pieces that come up, stick out,
we get towards the bottom, remember they need to fall instead. Going to go back to my palette, make it a little bit darker this time, just so it stands out a little bit better. Applying it predominantly in the middle. And remember, this doesn't have to be too detailed because we are going to add a lot of snow on top. So we're just kind of making the little base here. Nice and simple. Just make sure that it's not the same on each side. You want different areas to protrude in different places, some moving up, some moving down. You want it to still look interesting and captivating. So that's really our goal here. The edges can be a little bit brighter, where the middle to back should be significantly darker. Now we mixed a lot of paint, but we seem to have already used it. So we'll mix a little bit more. Get some black, some yellow, some of our blue. Good amount of yellow yet again. And we'll continue applying our pigment. It's taking a couple of layers because the background is so dark. You can even do it to this tree as well. Leaving little portions of the trunk showing through. Make it more interesting. A little more dynamic. Just applying this all in the same ways that we were before. As we get towards the bottom, it all gets a lot bigger, so the trees will blend a little bit more. For this area, I'm actually going to switch this brush out for a slightly larger square-headed brush, just to save a little bit of time. We don't need to worry about the details right here. There we go. Nice green. Now we need to make it a little bit thicker, so we'll add some black, add some titanium white, and we know we need to make it thicker because here you can see it's very bright, where there it's very dark. We're still seeing the white of the canvas showing through down here. And of course this is the back of the trees, so they need to be much darker than the tops, because they'll have a lot more shadows on them, and the edges, because it'll be much more thick, and light won't be able to penetrate it to such an easy extent. Cleaning my brush yet again, we'll go back and we'll do another application. Just going back and forth. This time I'll throw it on the edges with a little bit of a highlighted color. Build a little bit of depth. And then we can add our snow on top of this layer. Do a little bit of it in the back tree as well. Now some areas might be a little bit too thick like that, so we'll just blend it out a little bit. Use our finger, we'll use our brush, whatever we need to. Great. Nice base for our tree. Then I'm going to go back, grab some additional burnt umber, titanium white. I'm going to reinstill some of that middle area, highlights to it. Make it just a little bit more interesting. There we go. We can also take a little bit of that as well. Just make our window over here a little bit smaller. But it is a detailed area, so you probably want to do it with a smaller square-headed brush. Remember, it needs to be a little bit desaturated, be a little bit brighter. This is only if you made the window as big as I did. There we go. Much more subtle. When it dries, the color will match quite well. Then we can also take a little bit of that yellow, a little bit of that titanium white. Just cover up that area that was peeled off. A little bit of a tapping effect. Use our finger to make it a little bit more subtle. Now, as you can see here, as it's starting to dry, we're seeing that it's still a little bit transparent. So I'm going to do one more pass. I'll use the smaller brush because we don't need to do a big area. Just in here. Remember, it needs to be very dark around the back. That is exactly what we need it to be. So we're going to let that dry in totality, then we'll come back and we'll add some snow right on top of it. So while we do that, just going to grab a little bit of this darker green, re-interject that into the trees we have here, just because we lost a bit of it when we were adding the snow. Making it a little bit darker. It's the really nice thing about acrylic paints. They dry so quickly. So you can just go back while you wait for other things to dry, fix up the areas that you weren't entirely in love with. Just like that. So now I am going to let it dry, and I will see you with a clean water dish in about 3 seconds. Yet again, we are going to jump right back into our painting with our smaller square-headed brush. I'm going to grab some titanium white paint, trying to grab it from areas that aren't diluted already. I'm going to grab a little bit of our French ultramarine blue, just as we did before. This time though, we're going to make it a little bit more white because it's closer to us. Going to start as we did before at the top, being very delicate with our applications. Using the corner of my brush, but also the sides. Going over the middle portions as well. There we go, we're off to a good start. Going to make it a little bit more damp. Going to grab some additional titanium white. Going to pick an area and begin to apply that pigment. Remember, it's generally best to start at the bottom. There I started at the top, but generally best to start at the bottom and then blend upwards. Unless we're around the top of the tree, in which case the snow is just resting on small little pieces, and at which point I'd recommend starting at the top. So it changes as you move throughout the tree. We're consistently going to go back, get more pigment. Here we have a big piece, blending it up. Starting to run out of pigment, so we'll mix a little bit more, just as we've done in the past. There we are, leaving little openings, creating little gradients, trying to make sure that each application of snow looks slightly different than the one next to it. This tree is in front of this one, so we can play with that a little bit, as you can see. There we are, turning into a really beautiful Christmas tree. Now, of course, we do still have to do that tree, so we'll just get a little bit more there and do this in the same way that we just did. I might use a little bit more water to make the pigment slightly more transparent, so this tree is a little bit farther away, but for the most part it's a similar application style. At the top, we apply from the top. At the bottom, we apply from the bottom. We blend upwards subtly. Notice how this tree stands out slightly more than this one, because we're using more water in the application here, and it's a little bit more thin, it's a little bit more mixing with a dark background, it's a little bit more subtle. Now we're going to switch over to our smaller round-headed brush, incorporate some stars. First, I'm going to grab a little bit more of my primary yellow. So, we'll take a little bit of that, move it down here, take a little bit of our white, blend that up nicely. Now I want a star right here and right here. So I'll throw that there, throw that there. Then I'm going to blend them out softly with a lot of water. This will be a glowing effect that's coming from the star. And then we'll get a reflection down here in the water as well. Moving my brush back and forth to do that. Now, assessing this honestly, I don't really love that both of them are so bright. So I'm actually going to take this one out. And again, it just goes to show you that you should try things when you're doing your acrylic paints. Don't worry about it being too different or messing up the painting. We can always go back and fix things. So here I'm taking the old square-headed brush. I'm mixing up some primary blue, French ultramarine blue, whichever you're using, some Mars black, some of those other pigments, and we'll just cover it up. Needs to be a bit darker, so we'll grab some additional blue, we'll grab some additional black. It's probably too much black. Grab some more blue, mix them together, grab some of that titanium white, till we get a pigment we think will complement the area well. Begin applying that. Now it's a little bit dark and it's a little bit green, so we'll get a little bit more titanium white, a little bit more blue. Apply that. It's not perfect, but it's a good start. Washing my brush off quite well, and then drying it very well. as we'll need to do additional little applications here. So, grab some more of that titanium white, more of that blue, much brighter this time, but it won't look like this on the painting because the painting is still wet. It's going to blend to a point. So it's fairly bright there, not as bright as we had it on the palette though. Grab some of that darker pigment, mix that in. Still just working towards that color we had initially. And it can take a couple of applications. And that's good because going back is forcing us to remake those colors that we did in the sky. So if we ever want to do another painting like this, we have more practice at doing so. So I'm taking some more blue. Re-interject that back in there. Getting much closer now. Get a little bit of that black. Almost there. See? Nothing to worry about. Now, we don't have any stars in that area anymore because we covered them up, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take our smaller round-headed brush, add some water to it, get some of that titanium white paint, and fling that back in that area. Now some of it may come down to your mountains or that, but we can clean that up quite easily. I'm going to throw some additional stars up into the sky as it is. And now we can get back to the painting. So I'll grab a little bit of that yellow, grab a little bit of our white, add a little bit more of a highlight here in the middle, a little bit more of a highlight down here in the water, just in the middle area. Just kind of tapping it on, making it very subtle. There we are. If you want, we can also take more of that yellow, more of that titanium white, make other little stars of that color. It'll make that one look a lot more natural. You don't have to add it, by the way. Just because I'm doing it in my painting doesn't mean you need to do it in yours. You can soften them with your finger if you like. Might make it a little bit more interesting. There we are. And because we brought that light down so much, we can do it with the rest as well. So here, just dragging them down. And remember, if you want it to look very transparent, we go back, we grab a good amount of water, and we just drag that bottom portion down and let it dissipate. just like that. Now finally, for one more little touch-up, we can also take some red, some white, make a nice vibrant pink just like that. Get a lot of it off of our brush initially. We can throw that into the sky, really brightening it up in different areas. Be careful, you don't want to do too much with it. It's just to accent, bring out some really beautiful colors. You can even cover part of our star with it, make it a little bit more subtle. And if you feel like you've overdone it, as we do with a lot of this, remember, we can just take some blue, take some red, take some titanium white, mix up a similar color to what we had, work that on top. They will blend together and you'll get something much more subtle. But with that being said, I was going to end this, but then I realized, you know, we can throw a little bit of that reflection down here. Look really nice. This happens quite a bit. Nice to have some time to work on these. There we go. Okay. That, I think, I am very happy with. With all of that being said, that is essentially today's hour-long painting lesson. I truly hope you've enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned some new techniques, but also that you've learned some new ideas about painting itself. That you're supposed to take risks, that you're supposed to try things, that with acrylics it's a very forgiving medium, that you can go back, you can fix things, you can retry things, and we learn the most when we try things. So, I truly hope you've enjoyed. I hope that you have a wonderful time working on this lesson, that you create a beautiful rendition that you are proud of. I thank you so much for spending the time here with me today, and above all, as always, stay creative. Hey there, for those of you who are still sticking around, I got a little bit curious about what the painting would look like without this star and without this beam of light. So, as a little added plus, we're going to take them out and just see what the process looks like in doing that. Because I was curious, and I figured I might as well share it with you as well here. So, I'm going to begin by mixing up a very dark mixture of blue, something similar to what we had on the top here. I'm just going to cover that up. Nice and easy. Then I'm going to take that same color, because it should be similar to what we have down here in the water. I'm going to apply that there. Then, I'm going to go back to my water, clean off my brush a little bit, going to grab a little bit of my pink, mix it over here with some of that blue, apply that here. In this middle area needs to be a lot brighter though. So we'll grab some titanium white. Painting much more quickly here. It's not necessarily meant to be instructional, but just to show you what it looks like if you decide not to use that or if you decide to take it out. Now we'll get more of our blue, titanium white. We need a brighter blue right here. Add that in. Just bring it there. If we do all of that, I'm going to want to extend the top just a little bit. So we'll mix that up. There we are. Remember, you can soften the tapping application by just doing it a lot more.
So for the second time in this video, this painting is now complete. I won't do the whole outro yet again, but I would like to say just another little thank you for spending the time with me here today, and I really do hope that you create something that you feel very proud and happy with. So again, thank you so much, and stay creative.